So would you be able to enable screen sharing for me so I can share my
I certainly can, yeah. I think I can just make you a co-host.
Make him a co-host, yeah.
Let's immediately end the call.
Right, you should be okay now.
Yes, there we go. One moment. Okay, can everybody see that?
Yes, that's great. Thank you.
Yes, lovely. Right. So yeah, thank you, Chris, for giving me that little introduction there. So that's right. So yeah, my name's Cameron. I'm a final year medical student, and I took some time. It's encouraged that for some of us to take maybe a year outside of our degree and do something else for a year, basically. Some people do research masters, it's kind of all biochemically out in the lab. I've always been interested in psychology and particularly health psychology. So I decided to do a psychology master's last year. And yeah, so this project was essentially what I did for my dissertation. And you can see the title here. I will fight for people to not have the experience I've had, a thematic analysis of chronic pain lived experience advocates. So in terms of how this project began, so I initially came across this project that Chris was running, and I set up a little meeting with her to see if I could help on it. And we had a few discussions, and one of the things which Chris brought up is that essentially there's been lots of studies in the past on chronic pain itself, sort of qualitative studies where people get people's experiences and they kind of distill it into kind of overarching themes and try and describe the experience of chronic pain. But nobody's actually done that before for the people that fulfill this advocacy role, as Chris mentioned, people that share their experiences and their knowledge around pain from what they've learned as patients. So I'll bring this a little bit up here. So yeah, so as we know, people with chronic pain have a unique perspective in understanding this mismatch between what support people need and what kind of healthcare services and society at large provide. And this meeting is a fantastic example of some people share their experiences in the aim of bridging this gap. And there's lots of different ways in which people do this. And I was really struck by this, actually. In my head, I kind of thought that, yeah, there'll be people that sit on committees in hospitals, people that help write clinical guidelines. That's kind of where my medical bias was coming from, really. But there were people that there were people that streamed on Twitch, people that made YouTube videos, people that had written books, people that were sort of moderating like groups on social media. This massive sort of array of different things that people did. And the kind of advent of social media has allowed people to build up their own independent voices as well, rather than doing things all through the kind of researchers and the clinicians. And with that point in mind, there has been a massive increase in research and service delivery, with patients being partners in that process rather than just participants. Of course, there's still a bit of a way to go, but say if you think of the past 15, 20 years, there's been much more of a shift towards that. There has actually been some research on advocates for different groups. So people who inject drugs, people with HIV, and sex workers are three examples of where sort of peer advocates in those groups sort of help provide support services. And there has been a bit of research into their experiences. And a couple of interesting things came up, such as the kind of emotional labor of doing that job and sort of making being put in a position where they can make a meaningful contribution and that their position as sort of peer advocate is respected. So that helps kind of guide us on what kind of issues we would focus on and what direction we would take. But we also didn't want to assume, because they're very different things and people sort of in very different roles. And yeah, just a quick note on what Chris said as well. And I'm very glad she sort of discussed the terminology we'll be using as sort of patient advocates, because she put it a lot better than I was planning on. But yeah, it's this kind of, I've been in this meeting before when we discussed that term, and the challenge in research is that you need to be able to describe who you research with a term that is specific enough to be descriptive, but not so specific that you're excluding people, but not too vague that you're leaving people out. So we kind of settled on this term as the kind of, imperfect as it is, the kind of best way to be able to communicate clearly what we're talking about. Yeah, so what did you want to achieve with this research? So we wanted to kind of unravel the experiences of people who advocate for chronic pain, why they do it, different experiences that they have, and how this kind of relates and intersects with their experience of chronic pain. An important point which I put at the bottom is that this research and the results I'm about to give you is an analysis of the things that our participants said. It cannot necessarily be generalized to every single person who does this kind of thing, because it's not that kind of study. And I think one of the interesting points for discussion would be sort of to what degree people do or don't identify with these things. But as part of our research, we're not making that kind of assumption. Okay, so who did we have involved? So we had 10 participants with quite a sort of interesting range of ages. So people in sort of their mid-20s all the way up to people in their late 60s. We had people whose experience of pain had begun very early in life, sort of in their childhood and teenage years. And we had people whose experience of pain didn't begin until later on in life. Most of our participants were British, but we had a couple of Aussies and Americans and Australians as well. So kind of over the Anglosphere, basically. And as I've alluded to, we've had people who do lots of very different things. So Twitch streamers, which I thought that was crazy. Twitch to me was something that people streamed live video games on. I had no idea people were sort of streaming content about pain education and things. I thought that was incredible. We've had people who've written books, people who sit on hospital committees, people who collaborated with the Self-Help Act, people who are very active on social media, people who've worked with charities and organizations to try and get their message out there. And sort of in this design of this study, we also had a person, so somebody who was also a chronic pain advocate, who we had a sort of a meeting with when designing our interviews and our questions, to make sure firstly that the questions we had were asking the right questions, asking the right things and were appropriate, and any kind of suggestions around what other things we might be missing and what we could ask, just to make sure that we had a kind of rigorous process. And then their data and their responses wasn't actually used in the report, that was put to one side. So I don't expect this diagram to make sense now. This is kind of a roadmap of the things we're going to be discussing. This is essentially a diagrammatic representation of the results we had and what we kind of distilled this experience into. So thinking of sort of when I was kind of sat down with Chris, when I had all my data, I'd done the interviews, I was thinking, what kind of narrative is there here? She kind of brought up this idea of almost like a journey. And I thought, yeah, when looking at that kind of fits actually, and it was then my responsibility to put it all together. So I'll kind of, can you see my mouse moving on the screen, by the way, if I point something out? Yeah, good. So I'll kind of give a quick sort of summary on what each one of these is, and then we'll go through each one in turn. So we have 3 themes which we identified from this research. The first one being advocacy is healing. This theme kind of represents people's route into advocacy, their motivations and their experiences which led them to that point. So we have this experience of this idea of people's experience with pain and the kind of difficult experiences and trauma that left a lot of our participants with. We then have this process where they learn about pain and they gain knowledge about things like self-management and different strategies which work for them, which weren't available to them at the beginning, and noticing this big sort of improvement and control over their pain. And we reach this point where people have had success, they've sort of gained more control of their pain, they're living a better life, and they kind of want to spread that experience on. So it's kind of what's bringing people into advocacy. We then have this middle point where this is kind of, in my kind of a sort of informal terms, this is where it gets serious. So this is the point where becoming a patient advocate becomes a role that people have, an identity that people have, and how they navigate that role and identity when interacting with other pain advocates, clinicians, professionals, and organizations, and the different challenges and both positive and negative interactions that come with that. Then we have this final point here, evolution, where we talk about the challenges that come with being a patient advocate, the things that people do to overcome those, and what advocacy has given back to the people that we interviewed. And this is really a fantastic thing to listen to, and a fantastic thing to write about, because there was a lot basically that people have learned from and grown with through their advocacy. So we'll go through these things one by one, and we'll start with advocacy as healing. So this essentially, as I kind of alluded to, start with people's experiences of pain. And I want to draw attention to this quote here. So we can see this was a person whose experience with pain started when they were quite young, and they lost out on a lot of experiences like their sort of secondary school, weddings, parties, holidays. And they had this really significant sense of loss about that had been caused by their experiences about what could have been. And I was quite struck by this language here, being haunted by it. I think that's very sort of visceral language and really speaks to that sense of loss. The experiences that people had with their pain was quite varied. Some people had someone who I spoke to whose pain began later in life talked about not being able to play with their grandkids, and like they remembered their granddad doing, and that same sense of loss but coming from a slightly different angle. And then I had some people who had experiences with medications, sort of like opioids and other medications that people have the pain. Not all of our participants did, but quite several did. And some of the experiences I heard around really like a sense of helplessness and hopelessness, someone being, having to be cared for 24/7 and not being able to do anything for themselves. So, people's experiences differed, but there was certainly a degree of trauma and a degree, sort of a very heavy experience that really weighed on them. And so with that kind of being said, that this kind of experience wasn't necessarily the focus of our study, because there's lots of things that already described this, but it's a very key sort of introductory part as to why people will do what they do. And we reach onto this this second part here, where if we look at the quotes, if I can just move this out of the way, sorry. There we go, I've got all your faces which are blocking where it is. There we go. So talking about these new ideas that hurt doesn't necessarily mean harm is an example, is something that some people engage with and that they find helps them. Basically, this idea of self-management, and people do it in lots of different ways. Some people do it with mindfulness, some people use that like curable. There's lots of variety of different ways that people do that. And basically, that we have this idea that people kind of have an improvement in their pain, and people get a success and they want to share that knowledge. So we kind of move on to this final point here, where it says, I will fight for people to not have the experience that I've had. I think you kind of see here that the person who said this views their experience as avoidable and something which could be prevented happening to others if they'd had that knowledge at sort of a previous point in time. It kind of represents, so someone put it really well, actually. They described it as the pain merry-go-round, where they're seeing person and seeing doctors, psychologists, clinicians, and they're not being helped. And they get to this point where they learn about these different techniques around like self-management, and they step off the pain merry-go-round. And it has this kind of impact down here, where it's it's, it says it just changes your life. It's life-changing. It has this massive impact. And then they wish to share that with other people. And I've got some kind of interesting points in the discussion about why, sort of, kind of what that means to people that sort of a layer behind it, but we'll come on to that a little bit later. Okay. So sort of coming back to this for a moment, hopefully you kind of understand what I mean here, where we have this kind of experience of trauma, gaining knowledge, and then trying to share that knowledge with others to provide that sense of relief and success that person has. Okay. And so now this section here about recognition, this was a really interesting section. It's the one that in the actual dissertation itself I wrote the most about. In the actual, so we're trying to kind of get this project published at the moment, and they have quite strict word limits, which is several thousand words shorter than what I was allowed to say for my dissertation. So a lot of this has been taken out with the idea that it can be made into another paper in of itself, basically. But I think some of the conclusions and the ideas that are in there could actually be really interesting points for discussion. So I'm going to sort of go into it a bit more detail. So yeah, this is where the role becomes a bit more formalized, and it becomes sort of something people does, is part of their identity. And it now sort of becomes much more of a social thing where you're interacting with people that do a role similar to yourself, you're interacting with professionals, and you're interacting with sort of organizations, charities, people who organize conferences, all that kind of things. So a number of our participants had been to conferences that are based around pain. Some of them had spoke at conferences and some of them hadn't. And I have met many healthcare professionals in my time. And I was expecting that some people would have had experiences where they were maybe not dealt with in a very nice way, or they maybe were dismissed possibly, or spoken to sort of, I was expecting a couple of horror stories, and to my surprise, the response that I got from people was overwhelmingly positive. So we take this quote here, where this person spoke, actually, if I remember the interaction, it was a medical conference. I think it was I can't remember what specialty they were presenting to. And people were coming up to them, they were asking questions and seemed genuinely interested. And you see this last sentence here where this person feels like a part of the solution rather than this kind of abrasive voice trying to give a different perspective. And I think that represents someone feeling brought into the fold almost, that they now feel as though they're collaborating to a shared goal, which is in contrast to some of the experiences that people I spoke to had as a patient with their doctors, with their psychologists, with their clinicians. So I think that represents, I think it's very positive actually, that at least in person, that professionals in this area that specialize in pain are, from the experiences of people I spoke to, are very receptive to hearing their story. Yeah, so, and sort of a couple of other experiences that I had, people who worked directly with healthcare professionals, sort of experiences that I heard of people working directly with healthcare professionals, either on committees, they generally felt listened to, they felt respected, or sort of collaborating directly on projects, and they felt sort of, I'm going to take a small quote here, like part of the team, which is definitely very encouraging. But that's very interesting when you listen to people's experiences dealing with organizations, and these two themes, these two sub-themes which are within the theme are very contrasting actually. So I'll give you this example down here. Somebody who went down to London to film or record something, and they've given up their time for free, they'd had their train tickets paid for, but they got there and they realized that the actors, the cameramen, everyone on set was being paid and they weren't. So that kind of represents an actual devaluing of that person's expertise, certainly amongst the people in the room. And could you imagine if there was a pain sort of, you know, a doctor who specializes in pain that was producing an education resource of that sort of them not having any kind of fee? It's kind of sort of changes kind of disrupts the parity of those sort of two different roles and values lived experience as different to clinical experience. There was a couple of other points around this, not necessarily just around pay, even though that was something that was brought up, and this kind of idea that you know, if someone was a professional clinician, you would value their expertise in the sense that you would give them some kind of remuneration for it, whereas we don't have that kind of assumption with people's lived experience, which they are providing to you. I think that might be an interesting discussion point for later. There was a couple of other things, like, say, in conferences. Some conferences don't allow patients to attend. It's a healthcare professional only. And there was some people presenting this idea that it's not always as easy as you think to get a seat at the table as well. So to kind of summarize that together, you have these two opposing points of positive interactions with individuals, but not always positive, in some often quite negative interactions with organizations. And I think it's interesting why there is that kind of disconnect, as organizations are made up of individuals. Might be interesting things to discuss. So we'll move on from that now, and we'll come back to this sort of this thematic diagram where we've now discussed people's route into advocacy. We've discussed a couple of the kind of navigating that world in your role and how you interact with other professionals and organizations. And we'll now discuss the final sub-theme, which is evolution, and where we'll discuss the challenges that people have in their role as an advocate and how they deal with it, and the things that they take back, that they feel like it's given back to them. So, in terms of the different challenges that people have in advocacy, this top one here, I'm not really good at saying no. I do have to be careful, and I have at several times gone a bit too far and brought on a flair that I needn't have had. This idea of not being able to say no, or not being good at saying no, came up with several different people. It seems to be quite a common thing, and it wasn't necessarily people feeling as though they couldn't say no, or feeling bad because they'd let people down, something like that. It's often that people were so interested in what they were doing that they just signed up for too many things and overstretched themselves, which I think was quite interesting. And this kind of feeds into this next point here around social media. And there's a couple of other points I want to discuss about social media, in that this person took pride in responding to everyone that interacted with their social media posts. But as their profile grew, that became quite emotionally draining for that person. And it just wasn't sustainable anymore. And I think the kind of point that comes with both of these is recognizing your own limits and learning when to put your boundaries down. So people talked about pacing was something that people used. Some people mentioned about how they'd spread their deadlines out and make sure that they had sort of several hours in between meetings if they needed a bit of recovery time. And you can see that this person in the second quote just had to kind of let go of this idea that they had to reply to everyone, because it just wasn't fair on them to expect that of themselves. Another interesting challenge that comes with social media, which I'm sure those of us who use Twitter will be aware of, is that it can be quite a frenetic debate at times. And something that came up specifically that came from for a few people, the kind of message that they were trying to get out, sort of that an example being that hurt doesn't necessarily mean harm, and that you can sort of do a lot of things with how you view pain to try and improve your experience of it. For a lot of people who've been in a healthcare system which hasn't listened to them, haven't validated to them, they can be in a position where they're not ready to hear that message. And it can sound close to this "it's all in your head" idea, and can then react quite viscerally negative. I think one person I spoke to, someone said that they were going to hit him around the head with a piece of wood and then tell him that hurt didn't mean harm, or that hurt didn't always mean harm. And it's a misunderstanding of the message, but with that person's experience, that's how they interpret it. So in trying to put that message out there, they've kind of invited this kind of, or they haven't invited this response, but somebody has chosen to respond in that way to them. And that was a particular challenge that person described. So yeah, we've kind of discussed there two of the challenges that people have in terms of being able to manage their pain alongside the kind of role that they're doing and the different ways that people do that. We'll kind of move on to this last point now, where this is possibly my favorite quote in the entire thing, actually. When it was always the last question I asked in my interviews, and it was a very open-ended question. I just said, so what has advocacy done for you? Or something to that effect. And I really got some fantastic answers. And you can see this person reflect on both through their experience of pain and dealing with their pain and going through this process of advocacy and helping others, the kind of benefits that that brought to them in their view as a person, a more sympathetic listener because of accepting and understanding themselves. Other people who I spoke to discussed how they did things that they never thought they'd be able to do. They spoke to rooms full of people when public speaking absolutely terrified them. There were people who were, who'd invested in equipment to film, YouTube videos and streams and things like that, and were, producing this content on their own, basically, which they never thought they'd do. And it's one of those things which, when you think about it, it makes sense, but it's not so immediately obvious what advocacy can do to help people, and how you sort of take this difficult situation to begin with and turn it into something that sort of helps you achieve your potential in a way, which I think is really interesting. I think that's all I have to say on that. I'm just going to have a check if there's anything else I want to get across to everyone. Yeah, so I hope this makes a little bit more sense now, and we can kind of sort of see this journey happening from the beginning over here, where people go into advocacy because of their experiences and their success with their pain and try and share that, to this becoming a role and an identity and navigating that role within the pain world, so to speak. And where you end up here, where you have to overcome challenges and learn new skills and sort of fulfill your own potential. And when I say a journey, this isn't necessarily a temporal journey. It's not necessarily this thing, then this thing, then this thing. This gaining knowledge can occur at any point. Learning and growth can appear at the very beginning, but it's sort of not necessarily a point in time they can occur at once, but one thing leads to another, if that makes sense. Okay, so just kind of a quick, usually in the actual paper, we'd have a discussion section where I would relate these findings back to the literature and see what kind of conclusions we can draw from it. So I've kind of truncated that a little bit into the key points that I find interesting. So in terms of how advocacy helps people, what is actually going on there? I think this idea of catharsis and healing through advocacy is a really interesting one. I actually had more than one person directly describe their advocacy to me as a form of therapy. And I think that may or may not be true for everyone, but for that person or those people, that this kind of, when they allow others to experience the success that they have, that, when you help somebody, you feel good. That's an empathetic response. When you make someone feel happy, right? So there's this kind of empathetic response. And when you prevent somebody else from experiencing the negative things that you did, it can also sort of provide a sense of consolation for that possibly as well, which I think is an interesting point. The second point I wanted to make here is that, sort of in psychology, sometimes in medicine as well, we talk about this idea of the cycle of change model. And when you change a behavior, there's different stages to that. So you have a contemplation stage where you decide that something needs to change. You then take, is that the right order? So you then take action start a bit again. So when you're wanting to make a change, you prepare to make that change, then you contemplate that change, you then prepare to make that change, you then do the action that is required to make that change, and then you need to maintain that change. And then the kind of unhappy last step sometimes is a potential relapse. And I think that advocacy for many people is something that anchors them within that maintenance stage, that keeps the ship going straight, keeps the train on the tracks, in a sense, in that leading others towards improvement reinforces their own success and acts as that anchor in that maintenance stage. I think there's possibly a degree of, when you help somebody reach this point where they've managed to gain control of their pain and improve their quality of life, then there's a sense of, when you see that success in someone, kind of live it vicariously through them in a way, which I'll be interesting to hear if people identify with that or not. And the final point, I alluded to it earlier, of this transformation of an experience that weighs very heavily on someone, that may have very dark and negative connotations to someone, to take that experience and you transform it into something which is an asset and which helps other people. I think that's quite, the fact that somebody is able to do that is quite a crazy thing. And you form a new meaning and an identity from an illness to one of kind of helplessness and loss to one of agency and opportunity. And through that, through the kind of new skills and things that you do and the confidence that you may gain, you can reach a point of self-actualization, sort of, in other words, or fulfillment of one's own potential, which I think kind of is an interesting way of describing the kind of benefits that people describe that they gain themselves through their advocacy. So that is everything I have to say on that. Sorry for the slightly garbled presentation, but yeah, so I've left my email there on the bottom. Anybody who emails me is very welcome to have a copy of the whole paper itself. I found it quite challenging to distill the themes that I spoke about there into basically a couple of minutes talking, when the original thing I wrote was 13,000 words, not including the quotes. So if you kind of want a more nuanced and complete view of kind of the research that we did, then I'd be happy to send that to anyone. And this is kind of an overview. So yeah, is there sort of time before we discuss anything? Is there any specific questions anyone has for me about the study itself or how we did things, or?
That's brilliant, Cameron. Thank you so much. I'll just stop the recording so people can ask questions sort of happily.